The air in a room like this has a particular quality. It is warm without being hot, still without being silent, and it carries in it the accumulated breath of everyone present, something the body registers before the mind does. The legs feel it first, a faint heaviness, the kind that arrives after standing in one place for longer than the body expected. The sound of other people breathing is everywhere and low. The ceiling is close. The walls hold the warmth in, and the body, without any instruction from the person it belongs to, is already making small adjustments, narrowing blood vessels here, diverting resources there, doing what it has always done in warm enclosed spaces full of other warm bodies, which is to say, it is managing. What it does next in some of these rooms, on some of these occasions, is something else entirely. A person stands still, and then, without deciding to, begins to go down, not violently, not with warning. The legs stop holding, and the floor comes up, and the body arranges itself on the ground with the particular boneless quality of genuine unconsciousness, and then, in the seconds and minutes that follow, other bodies in the same room begin to do the same thing, one after another, not because anything in the air has changed, not because anything in the water or the food or the ground beneath the building has shifted, because something passed between the people in that room, something that had no weight and no smell and no chemical signature, and the bodies responded to it as genuinely as they would have responded to any physical agent. This is not a rare event. It has happened in schools, in factories, in military formations, in religious ceremonies, in hospitals, in offices, on parade grounds, in examination halls. It has been happening in documented form for at least 5 centuries. The World Health Organization has a name for it. Researchers have a taxonomy. Physiologists have identified the exact sequence of events that takes place inside the body when it happens. And what those researchers found when they looked carefully at all of it is that the phenomenon is entirely genuine, measurable, repeatable, physiologically coherent, and that the agent causing it is, in a precise and technical sense, other people. The clinical term is mass psychogenic illness. The World Health Organization recognizes it as a genuine medical and sociological phenomenon. The definition, in its formal version, describes physical symptoms: fainting, nausea, trembling, dizziness, difficulty breathing, spreading through social transmission rather than biological contagion among people sharing a common environment. That last phrase is doing important work. Sharing a common environment does not mean sharing a germ. It means being in the same room, at the same time, in the same social situation, with the same awareness of what the people around them are experiencing. The shared environment is not a petri dish, it is a context. And contexts, under certain conditions, turn out to be capable of producing the same physiological cascade in multiple people simultaneously that a pathogen produces in one. The word psychogenic sits in the middle of that clinical term and deserves some attention before anything else. It does not mean imagined. It does not mean performed. It does not mean that the people experiencing these symptoms are choosing to experience them, or exaggerating, or behaving in any way that is not entirely involuntary and genuine. The distinction between psychogenic illness and deliberate malingering is not a subtle one. It is measurable, and it has been measured. Researchers using electrodermal monitoring, which tracks the small changes in skin conductance that accompany genuine autonomic stress responses, have recorded those changes in people experiencing psychogenic symptoms. The readings look the way they look in people undergoing real physiological distress. Heart rate variability studies, which examine the beat-to-beat fluctuation in cardiac rhythm as a marker of autonomic nervous system function, have confirmed the same thing. The nervous system of a person experiencing a psychogenic faint is doing what a nervous system does when the body is in genuine distress. The experience is not being fabricated. The mechanism is simply a different one than the mechanism that produces a fever. Neuroimaging has added another layer to this picture. Studies using functional imaging during psychogenic episodes have found activation patterns in the brain consistent with real sensory processing of symptoms. The regions associated with body awareness, with threat detection, with the monitoring of internal physical states, all show the activity that would accompany genuine physical experience. The brain is not running an empty performance, it is processing something. The signal it is processing has come not from a bacterium or a toxin, but from the social world, and that from the nervous systems of the people nearby, from the accumulated meaning of the shared situation. And yet the body's response to that signal follows the same physiological pathways it would follow if the trigger had been entirely physical. This matters because the easiest misunderstanding about mass psychogenic illness, the one that lingers even after the formal explanations are given, is that it must involve some form of deception, either deliberate or unconscious. It does not. The body being described here is not performing distress, it is experiencing it. The distinction sits in the mechanism, not in the authenticity of the response. The mechanism begins with stress. When the body encounters a genuine psychological stressor, real anxiety, real fear, real apprehension about a situation, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activates. This is the brain's primary stress response system, a cascade of hormonal signals that begins in the hypothalamus and travels through the pituitary gland to the adrenal cortex, which then releases cortisol and other hormones into the bloodstream. This is a well-mapped system. It is the same system that activates before an important examination. In the moment a person receives bad news, in the middle of a situation that feels threatening or uncontrollable, it is not a malfunction, it is the body's standard equipment for dealing with difficulty. What happens when that system activates is not only cortisol. The downstream effects of HPA axis activation include direct impacts on cardiovascular function, changes in heart rate, changes in blood pressure regulation, alterations in the tension of blood vessels, and these changes, under the right conditions, are entirely capable of producing the physical sensations of dizziness, chest tightness, and the kind of lightheadedness that precedes fainting, even in the complete absence of any pathogen or toxin. The body does not need a germ to produce these physiological states. It needs only a nervous system responding to its environment in the way nervous systems respond to perceived threat, and a set of conditions: warm air, close proximity, shared anxiety, prolonged standing, that lower the threshold at which those responses tip over into syncope. Syncope is the medical term for fainting. It means a temporary loss of consciousness caused by reduced blood flow to the brain. There are several physiological pathways that can produce it, and the one most commonly involved in mass fainting events is a specific pattern in which a cascade of stress-related autonomic changes ends with the blood pressure dropping faster than the brain can compensate for. The person does not choose this. The timing is not controlled. The body simply reaches a threshold at which maintaining consciousness requires more cardiovascular support than it is currently receiving, and for a moment, usually brief, usually complete in itself, it stops. In a room full of people who are all experiencing elevated stress, all standing in warm air, all sharing an awareness that something is happening around them, that threshold becomes easier to reach. One person reaches it first, and then the social environment changes because now there is a person on the floor, and that has its own effect on everyone still standing. Simon Wesley and his colleagues, working through the accumulated documentation of these events across multiple countries and several centuries, proposed a formal taxonomy that divides mass psychogenic illness into two primary subtypes. The taxonomy is not just a naming convention, and it reflects genuine differences in how these events unfold, how long they last, and what they look like in the people experiencing them. The first subtype is called mass anxiety hysteria. The word hysteria carries its own complicated history, one the researchers themselves were aware of. But in this context, it is used as a clinical descriptor for a pattern of symptom presentation, rather than as a judgment about the people involved. Mass anxiety hysteria is characterized by rapid onset. The symptoms, fainting, hyperventilation, dizziness, nausea, appear quickly and spread quickly. An outbreak of this type typically begins and resolves within hours or days. It tends to occur in settings of acute, immediate environmental stress, a warm assembly hall, an examination room, a formal ceremony, in the heat. The index case, the first person to faint, is usually someone who is already at or near a physiological threshold, already warm and anxious and standing still, and the social transmission that follows their collapse accelerates through the room via a mechanism the physiology section of this understanding will return to in more detail. The second subtype is called mass motor hysteria. It develops along a different timeline entirely. Where the anxiety subtype unfolds in hours, the motor subtype unfolds over weeks or months. Where the anxiety subtype produces fainting and hyperventilation, acute, brief, resolved by lying down and removing oneself from the situation, the motor subtype produces tremors, involuntary movements, abnormal gait, and a range of motor symptoms that persist across time and environment. People experiencing mass motor hysteria do not simply recover when they leave the room. The symptoms continue, fluctuate, and in some cases persist for the full duration of the outbreak before resolving. These two subtypes sit in different columns of the researcher's taxonomy, and they are not interchangeable. The conditions that produce one are not the same as the conditions that produce the other. The speed at which they spread is different. The duration is different. The kinds of environments in which they occur tend to differ as well, with the motor subtype more commonly associated with prolonged, low-grade, institutional stress, the stress of a life organized by rules and routine and limited autonomy, while the anxiety subtype is more often linked to a single acute trigger, a particular day, a particular event, a particular moment of collective apprehension. One of the oldest events in the historical documentation of mass psychogenic illness belongs to the motor subtype. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, a city of perhaps 20,000 people going about the ordinary business of medieval urban life, a woman began to dance. This is not metaphorical. She danced in the street, without stopping, for days, and then others joined her, not because they wanted to, but because their bodies began to move in the same involuntary rhythmic way, and within weeks, there were reports of hundreds of people caught in the same involuntary movement, some of them collapsing from exhaustion, some of them dying. The dancing continued for most of the summer. This event, the dancing mania of 1518, sits in the motor symptom column of the taxonomy, the column for outbreaks that develop gradually, that produce complex involuntary movement, that unfold across a long stretch of time rather than resolving in a morning. When Wesley and colleagues and the researchers who followed them sorted through 5 centuries of documented events, building the 2-column framework that makes the pattern legible, the dancing mania was already in the literature as the oldest well-documented case. And the remarkable thing about finding it there, in the column marked slow onset, motor symptoms weeks to months, is that the events filling the anxiety column, the ones with rapid fainting and hyperventilation that resolved in hours, those events came from 5 centuries of records as well. Different countries, different centuries, different languages and climates, and social arrangements. Both columns full, the world contains a great deal that the body has never stopped being responsive to. A warm room, a crowd, the sound of someone nearby beginning to fall, the knowledge that the people around a person are experiencing something the body has not yet named but is already preparing to respond to. These are not exotic conditions. They are the ordinary background of shared human life, the assembly hall, the ceremony, the factory floor, the school morning, and the body moving through them is not passive. It is monitoring everything, the temperature, the faces, the sounds, the subtle physiological signals of the nervous systems nearby. It is doing this work all the time, quietly, beneath the level of awareness, because this is what the autonomic nervous system does. It runs as an infrastructure beneath social experience, adjusting, compensating, responding, and occasionally, in the right room on the right kind of day, responding in a way that crosses the floor and reaches other bodies. Not through the air, but through something the research has taken considerable effort to map. The autonomic nervous system is not a simple on-off switch. It is a continuous negotiation between 2 branches, the sympathetic, which prepares the body for action and alert, and the parasympathetic, which returns it to rest, and the balance between these branches shifts in response to the social environment in ways that are remarkably precise. The face of a calm person seen across a room has a measurable effect on the cardiovascular readings of the person looking at them. The sound of a voice expressing distress has a measurable effect on heart rate variability in the person hearing it. The body in a crowd is not experiencing the crowd abstractly. It is reading it continuously and updating its own internal state in response to what it reads. This is not a vulnerability or a flaw in the design of the human nervous system. It is a feature. The responsiveness of one body to the physiological state of the bodies around it is, from an evolutionary standpoint, an extremely useful capacity. It is the mechanism by which alarm spreads rapidly through a group, by which the distress of one individual is immediately available as information to everyone nearby, by which the emotional register of a room becomes a shared reality rather than a collection of private experiences. The same system that makes a person feel calmer in the presence of a calm friend makes a room full of anxious people a physiologically distinct environment from a room full of calm ones. The same capacity that allows a person to feel the weight of a shared grief makes the body in an anxious crowd subtly different, measurably different from the body in a quiet garden. Mass psychogenic illness is, in one framing, this system doing exactly what it does, in conditions that exceed a particular threshold. The bodies in the room are not malfunctioning. They are responsive. They are reading the room with the precision the nervous system has always brought to that task. What they are reading in the rooms where outbreaks occur is a level of collective physiological arousal, shared anxiety, shared apprehension, shared awareness of something going wrong that is high enough and sustained long enough to push the most vulnerable members of the group past the physiological boundary at which staying upright becomes difficult. And once the first person crosses that boundary, the room changes, because now the room contains the event of someone fainting and everyone still standing is reading that too. The taxonomy that Wesley and his colleagues built was not an exercise in naming things. It was an attempt to make the pattern legible across the full range of events in the historical record, to identify what features distinguished one kind of outbreak from another, what conditions predicted what outcomes, what the documentation across 5 centuries had in common, and what it didn't. The two columns, mass anxiety hysteria and mass motor hysteria, represent the most stable distinction that pattern offered up. In the anxiety column, events that moved fast, events that clustered around specific triggers, a warm ceremony, an examination day, an inspection, a vaccination campaign, events in which the affected individuals recovered quickly, once separated from the situation that had produced the symptoms. Events in which the spread of symptoms followed the social geography of the room rather than the airflow through it. In the motor column, events that moved slowly, events that unfolded over weeks and months in contexts of prolonged institutional stress, limited autonomy, or long-term shared pressure. Events in which the symptoms were more complex and more persistent, and in which recovery was slower and more variable. Both columns, when Wesley and colleagues examined them, contained events from multiple continents. Both contained events from multiple centuries. The earliest entries in the motor column dated to the medieval period. The most recent entries in the anxiety column were from the late 20th century. The phenomenon had not changed. The environments that produced it had not changed in the ways that mattered most. The warm room still existed. The shared anxiety still existed. The bodies in the room were still doing what they had always done, which was to read the people around them and respond to what they read. What the taxonomy offered was not an explanation of why human bodies do this. That question sits in the physiology of the autonomic nervous system, in the specific mechanics of what happens inside a body in the seconds before a faint, in the measured pathways by which social stress produces real cardiovascular change. The taxonomy offered something different, a structure for recognizing the pattern when it appeared, for distinguishing the events that would resolve in hours from the events that would continue for months, for separating genuine psychogenic transmission from the possibility, always the first thing investigators look for, of a physical agent affecting the group through some channel that had not yet been identified. This last distinction matters more than it might seem. When a room full of people faint at approximately the same time, the immediate and entirely reasonable assumption is that something in the environment, a gas, a chemical, something in the food or water or air, is the cause. Investigation begins with that hypothesis. It begins, as it should, with air quality monitors and water samples and toxicological analysis and careful documentation of who was where when the first symptoms appeared. Most of the time in these events, that investigation finds nothing. The air is clean, the water is clean, the food is unremarkable, the ventilation system is functioning, there is no point source, no chemical gradient, no distribution of symptoms that follows airflow rather than social connection. What the investigation finds instead, when it looks carefully enough, is the pattern the taxonomy was designed to recognize. Symptoms spreading along lines of social proximity, resolving rapidly when affected individuals are removed from the group, leaving unaffected those people who were physically present but socially disconnected from the initial cases. That pattern is its own kind of evidence. It does not look like the distribution of a chemical agent. It looks like the spread of information through a social network, because in the relevant sense, that is what it is. A cardiograph printout from someone experiencing a psychogenic faint looks like what it is, a real cardiovascular event. The curve of the heart rate dropping is not different in form from the curve that would appear on the same printout if the person had fainted from heat or dehydration or blood loss. The body is not making a distinction between physical triggers and social ones. The body does not have a category for that distinction. It has a set of sensors monitoring the internal and external environment, a set of systems that respond to what those sensors report, and a threshold beyond which the response produces syncope. What the threshold responds to is not limited to the category of things that can be identified under a microscope. The distinction that matters between mass psychogenic illness and deliberate performance is not the one most people think to make first. The more intuitive distinction between something that is real and something that is not real does not apply here in the way it might seem to. The symptoms are real, the physiological events are real and measurable. The thing that is different is the initiating signal, social and emotional, rather than microbial or chemical. That difference does not make the response any less genuine. It makes the mechanism more interesting. 5 centuries of events, 2 columns in a researcher's taxonomy, one for outbreaks that began and ended quickly, hours, sometimes days, that moved fast through rooms and resolved when people were separated, one for outbreaks that unfolded slowly across weeks and months, that produced persistent motor symptoms in contexts of sustained and prolonged shared stress. Both columns populated with events from different centuries and different continents, different climates and different languages, and different social arrangements, all of them instances of the same basic thing, a body in a shared environment, reading what the bodies around it are experiencing, and responding with the only tools it has, which are the tools it always uses. The researchers sorting through this record were not looking for strangeness. They were looking for pattern, and the pattern they found was coherent, replicable, and in retrospect, not entirely surprising, because the responsiveness of the human nervous system to the states of other nervous systems is not an edge case capacity. It is the foundation of social life. The body has always read the room. It has always adjusted itself to what it found there. What mass psychogenic illness represents is a particular set of conditions in which that adjustment produces, in many bodies simultaneously, a threshold response, real, involuntary, genuine, to something that was never in the air at all. The taxonomy sits there with its 2 columns and its 5 centuries of events as a quiet record of that capacity. The anxiety column is longer in terms of number of events because the conditions that produce it, warm enclosed spaces, acute shared stress, a moment of collective apprehension, are more common than the conditions that sustain a months-long motor outbreak. But both columns are long. Both required considerable sorting. When the researchers working through the historical record began assigning events to one column or the other, applying the criteria of onset speed, symptom type, duration, and environmental context, they found that they had more material than they had expected, enough to fill both columns many times over, across every continent where records had been kept, from the late medieval period through the early 21st century. The body in a warm room, standing still in a crowd, surrounded by people sharing a particular kind of day, is part of a very long story. The heaviness in the legs is ordinary. The shared sound of breathing is ordinary. What happens next on the occasions when it happens is something the body does with the same uncomplicated involuntary authority with which it does everything else, an understanding that does not make the events in the taxonomy less interesting. It makes them, if anything, more so. In the spring of 1983, the mornings in the West Bank came in with the particular quality that early spring mornings have in that part of the world, a light that is still thin, the air still cool enough to carry the smell of stone, and the school day beginning the way school days do everywhere, with the ordinary sounds of a building filling up. Chairs moved, bags were set down, windows were opened to let in the morning air before the heat of the day arrived. The girls in the classrooms were doing what students do in the first hour, finding their seats, half attending, arranging their things on the desk in front of them. Nothing in that morning announced itself as different from any other morning. And then, in one of those classrooms, a girl sat down on the floor because she could no longer stand. She was not the only one. Within the hour, there were others. Within the day, there were others still. Within a week, the reports were coming in from schools across a wide area of the West Bank. Dizziness, nausea, a sudden and unaccountable weakness in the legs, followed by fainting. Not one school, not one classroom, but dozens. Not one day, but many days, stretching across March and into April, then intensifying again before it stopped. The count of affected individuals, once the investigations were complete, exceeded 900 people, most of them schoolgirls between the ages of 12 and 17, with some female teachers among them. The investigators who arrived found a situation that did not fit any template cleanly. The affected individuals reported headache, nausea, weakness, dizziness, and abdominal pain. Some fainted. Some were found sitting or lying on the ground in schoolyards and corridors, being helped by classmates and teachers. The pattern of who was affected, and when, and where, was the puzzle that the investigators brought their full attention to bear on. The investigation that followed involved Israeli health authorities, Jordanian health officials, and international health organizations. Environmental samples were taken, air quality was measured, water was tested, food supplies were examined. Laboratory analyses were conducted on blood and urine samples from affected individuals. The process was thorough and documented, and when it was complete, no toxic agent had been found, no bacterium, no chemical compound, no airborne contaminant. The physical environment at each school was examined with care, and the physical environment at each school was found to be what it appeared to be, an ordinary school. What the investigation did find was a pattern in the timing. Outbreaks at individual schools tended to intensify on days following news reports of illness at neighboring schools. The knowledge that others nearby had been affected seemed to function as a kind of signal, arriving ahead of any direct contact and raising the anxiety of students and teachers at schools not yet involved. The investigation also found that in many individual outbreaks, the spread of fainting within a single school followed social connections rather than spatial ones, those nearest to the first affected student, and those with the closest relationships to her were the most likely to be affected next. The investigators concluded that what had moved through those dozens of schools was not a pathogen. It was something else, something that traveled through shared information and shared feeling, through the specific vulnerability of a large group of young people under concentrated stress in a setting where the news from one morning carried weight into the next. The formal classification that followed identified the episode as one of the largest single outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness recorded in the 20th century. The girls who had sat down on the floors of those classrooms, and the teachers who had leaned against walls and been helped to chairs, had experienced real physical symptoms, symptoms that their bodies had produced without any external agent requiring them to. The physiological distress was not performed. The fainting was not fabricated. What had been absent was the bacteria or the toxin that investigators had spent weeks looking for. What had been present instead was something that investigators had fewer instruments for measuring, but eventually, carefully, named: The 1983 West Bank episode is one of the most extensively studied examples in the documented record of mass fainting events. The record itself, though, is long, and it contains events from many different kinds of places. The conditions that produced that particular spring of school-by-school outbreaks have a different texture from the conditions that produced other episodes. And part of what makes the record interesting is how many different surfaces a single phenomenon can take on when it arrives in different settings. Another episode, documented in a country very different in its geography and its context, shows the same underlying mechanism finding its way through a different kind of door. In Portugal, in 2006, several thousand miles from the West Bank, and more than 2 decades later, secondary school students began experiencing fainting spells, dizziness, and difficulty breathing. The episodes appeared at multiple schools in different parts of the country. They spread through the school day, rather than arriving at a single fixed moment, and they arrived without warning in corridors, classrooms, and outdoor spaces. The Portuguese health authorities, who began investigating the reports, found themselves looking at a pattern that did not indicate environmental contamination. The timing of the outbreaks and the distribution of affected students suggested a social transmission rather than a biological one. The investigation eventually identified a possible point of origin that no environmental audit would have uncovered: a television drama. The program was called morangos.com, açúcar, which translates roughly as strawberries with sugar, and at the time of the outbreak, it was the most watched teen drama in Portugal. The episode in question had aired in the weeks before the school outbreaks began, and it featured a prominent storyline in which a fictional illness spread through a school, affecting the student characters with symptoms that included fainting and breathing difficulty. Millions of young viewers had watched it. In the days after the episode aired, students at real schools began experiencing those same symptoms. What the television drama had provided was a template, a detailed, emotionally charged, visually specific account of exactly what it looked like when a school was affected by an illness, and exactly what the affected students experienced. The drama had not caused any pathogen to spread. It had provided a form, and in a significant number of young people who were already in the kinds of social and emotional conditions that lower the threshold for psychogenic response, that form was enough. The Portuguese investigation became a documented example of what researchers in the field sometimes describe as a media-borne index event, a case in which the first effective transmission of a symptom pattern occurs not through direct physical contact, but through broadcast. The mechanism is the same as in every other documented outbreak. A susceptible individual in a shared social environment experiences a real physiological response that is triggered not by a toxin, but by an expectation, a fear, or a social signal. In Portugal, in 2006, that signal had arrived through a screen in the evening and been carried into school buildings the following morning. The affected students were not confused or deceived in any simple sense. Their nervous systems had received a signal and responded to it with the same sincerity with which nervous systems respond to all signals. The fact that the signal had arrived through a television program rather than through direct observation made it unusual in the documented record, but it did not make the response any less physiologically real. The 2 episodes, the West Bank in 1983 and Portugal in 2006, share their essential structure despite their differences in setting, decade, and the particular pathway through which transmission occurred. Both involved groups of young women in institutional settings. Both produced genuine physiological symptoms without an identifiable environmental cause, and both demonstrated the way that social information can lower or raise the threshold at which a psychogenic response occurs. They are documented at some length. Other episodes in the record are briefer in the documentation, but equally precise in what they show. Military ceremonies have produced their own distinct strand of the documented record. The formal parade and its particular combination of physical demands, standing rigidly still for extended periods in heavy ceremonial uniform, often in warm weather, in a setting charged with authority and observed attention, creates a set of conditions that physiologists who study fainting have identified as among the most reliable for producing vasovagal events. The British Army has studied the phenomenon formally, producing internal guidance for managing the conditions that lead to ceremonial fainting, and has acknowledged that such events occur with enough regularity to constitute a predictable operational consideration. In the United States, Australia, India, and South Korea, similar patterns have been documented at formal military and state ceremonies. The individual events differ in their specifics, but the template they share is consistent. A group of people, often young, often well-trained, but also often in peak physical condition, rather than experienced in the specific demands of standing still under observation, holding position in conditions that the human cardiovascular system finds genuinely challenging. A specific event in London in 2008 offers a documented case from that strand of the record. During a rehearsal for the Trooping the Color ceremony, several soldiers collapsed on the parade ground while standing at attention. The event was observed by spectators, and the collapses occurred in close temporal sequence, one figure beginning to go down, and then, in the minutes following, additional figures collapsing. The spatial pattern of the collapses, as in other documented mass fainting events, was not random. The soldiers who fainted after the initial collapse were those positioned nearest to the initial faint, and those within the same unit or formation. The warmth of the day, the physical demands of ceremonial stillness, and the social transmission of physiological vulnerability through direct observation combined to produce an event that was documented, investigated, and added to the formal study of MPI in military contexts. No pathogen was involved. No toxin was found. What investigators described was the convergence of physical conditions with a social trigger, the sight of one's immediate neighbor going down, and the body's response to that convergence. The military ceremony strand of the documented record is notable for several reasons. The individuals involved are not a demographic group that popular understanding would associate with psychogenic illness. They are trained, physically capable, and operating in a context where composure under pressure is both required and deeply practiced. The occurrence of mass fainting events in this population is one of the clearer indications in the documented record that the mechanism involved is physiological and situational rather than a matter of individual psychological weakness. The autonomic nervous system responds to the conditions it finds itself in with the same consistency whether the person it belongs to is a schoolgirl in the West Bank or a soldier in ceremonial uniform on a London parade ground. The conditions are different. The response, in its essential form, is the same. Across the Atlantic, and in a different decade, the recorded events took on another form. In October of 2011, in the small town of Leroy, in upstate New York, a group of teenagers began experiencing symptoms that had not been present in their lives before, and that arrived without any apparent cause. The symptoms were specific and unusual: involuntary tics, repetitive vocalizations, and sudden jerking movements of the limbs. The first to be affected were girls who attended Leroy Junior Senior High School, and in the weeks following the first cases, more students began showing similar symptoms. By the time the cluster had been fully identified, at least 18 teenagers were affected. What made the Leroy case particularly prominent was the speed and intensity of the public attention it attracted. Parents were alarmed and organized. Local media coverage was followed by national media coverage. The school was inspected for environmental contamination. The playing fields adjacent to the school were investigated for chemical exposure related to a historical industrial site. Local health officials were joined by neurological specialists from the New York State Department of Health and subsequently by clinicians from the Cleveland Clinic who flew in to evaluate affected students. The investigation was extensive and public in a way that most MPI investigations are not. The neurological evaluations were careful and thorough. Each affected student was examined individually. Brain imaging was conducted. Genetic testing was performed to investigate whether a shared genetic factor might explain why multiple individuals in the same location had developed similar movement disorders simultaneously. No environmental toxin was identified at the school or on the grounds. No genetic factor was found that could account for the pattern of cases. The neurological evaluations produced a consistent finding across the majority of affected students. The symptoms were characteristic of conversion disorder, a condition in which genuine neurological symptoms occur without an underlying structural neurological cause, mediated by a psychological mechanism rather than a pathogen, a lesion, or a genetic factor. The formal diagnosis for the cluster as a whole was mass psychogenic illness. The Leroy case demonstrates something that the West Bank and Portugal cases also demonstrate, but demonstrates it with particular clarity: the extraordinary persistence of the search for a physical cause. The investigations at Leroy were not superficial. They were conducted by qualified specialists using appropriate instruments. The absence of a toxin was not a premature conclusion, but a finding arrived at after thorough examination. The persistence was appropriate. Mass neurological symptoms in teenagers warrant thorough investigation, and the conclusion, once reached, was stated with clinical precision. What the Leroy case also demonstrates is the way in which the arrival of public attention and media coverage can itself become a factor in the course of an outbreak, raising anxiety in affected individuals, their families, and their peers in a way that can intensify and extend a psychogenic event rather than resolving it. The documented record contains many episodes in which media coverage and official statements interact with the course of the outbreak in ways that investigators later identify as significant factors in its duration and spread. The 1983 West Bank case had shown this effect through news reports of affected neighboring schools. Leroy showed the same dynamic operating through television news coverage and social media at a speed and scale not available in 1983. The mechanism in both cases was the same: information about existing cases, communicated broadly and with urgency, reached people who were already in conditions of elevated anxiety and provided both a symptom template and a reason to attend to their own physical sensations with heightened alertness. The Leroy teenagers, for the most part, recovered. The majority of those who received early psychological treatment experienced resolution or significant reduction of their symptoms in the months following diagnosis. The tics and jerking movements diminished, and for most stopped. The recovery was not uniform and not instantaneous, and the public nature of the case created a layer of social difficulty that persisted beyond the symptoms themselves. The scrutiny of living in a small town where something widely reported had happened. The difficulty of a diagnosis that some families initially resisted. The ongoing requirement to explain something that resisted simple explanation. Those aspects of the case are part of the documented record as well. They are quieter parts of it, but they are present. The fifth documented strand of the record has a different geography and a different social texture from the West Bank, Portugal, London, and upstate New York. It is spread across multiple countries in Southeast Asia, and it plays out not in schools or on parade grounds, but on factory floors. Beginning in the 1990s and continuing through the 2000s, garment factories and electronics assembly plants in Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand began experiencing recurring outbreaks of mass fainting among their workforces. The episodes varied in scale. Some affected a handful of workers at a single workstation. Others affected several hundred employees in a single incident, emptying sections of factory floors and requiring the mobilization of local medical services. Individual factories experienced more than one outbreak over the years. Some factories experienced multiple outbreaks, separated by months. The epidemiological pattern was studied by international researchers, including teams from the World Health Organization's regional offices, and the findings were consistent across multiple sites and multiple countries. The workers affected were overwhelmingly young women. Many had traveled to the cities and industrial zones where the factories were located from rural areas, sometimes from significant distances, and many lived in dormitories or shared housing near the factory with co-workers from the same home region. Their working conditions were demanding: long hours, repetitive physical tasks, production quotas, limited breaks, and buildings that were often warm and imperfectly ventilated. The social structure of the factory floor was dense and intimate. Workers from the same dormitory sat near each other on the floor. Workers from the same village or the same region found each other and maintained their proximity. The social geography of the workstations was a geography of relationships, of shared history, of mutual obligation and care. When a worker fainted, she was most often helped first by the person sitting closest to her. That person was most often someone she knew well, a dormitory neighbor, someone from her home village, a close friend. The documented pattern of who fainted next, in outbreak after outbreak across multiple countries, followed the geography of those relationships. The collapses did not move outward along the ventilation system or along the airflow patterns that engineers mapped when they came to investigate. They moved outward along the lines of friendship and shared dormitory. Researchers who mapped both the social network of a given factory shift and the temporal sequence of fainting during an outbreak found that the two maps came close to coinciding. The person nearest to the initial faint was most likely to faint next, and by nearest the data meant nearest in relationship rather than nearest in spatial distance, though the two were often the same because friendship shaped where people sat. This pattern was documented with enough consistency across enough sites that it became one of the clearest empirical demonstrations available in the MPI research literature of the way psychogenic symptoms propagate along social networks rather than through physical transmission routes. Investigators measuring air quality in the affected factories found normal or near normal readings. Investigators testing for chemical exposure found nothing to account for the scale or pattern of the events. What they found instead, when they looked carefully at the social structure of the workforces, was a network, an intricate, dense, emotionally loaded network of young women far from home in physically demanding conditions, bound to each other by the specific closeness that comes from shared displacement and shared daily life. Some of the factory outbreaks in the regional record were attributed at the time to spirit possession, a cultural explanatory framework that has a long history in several of the affected countries and that offered an account of the events consistent with local understanding of how bodies can be affected by forces external to them. The spirit possession framework and the psychogenic illness framework are not mutually exclusive at the level of the affected individual's experience. What both frameworks agree on, at least in this respect, is that the body of someone in that factory was responding to something that originated outside of it, something that came, in some form, from the social world rather than from a contaminated air supply or a tainted water source. The research investigators working within the epidemiological tradition noted the spirit possession explanations in their documentation and examined the events within their own framework without treating the two accounts as incompatible in any way that needed to be resolved. The factory outbreaks in Southeast Asia are in some ways the most extensively studied strand of the MPI record in terms of their social structure. They are also the strand most clearly shaped by the particular conditions of industrial labor, the long hours, the physical demands, the distance from home, the specific social cohesion of a workforce of young women who have traveled to the same place, from the same places, and who have built, inside the factory walls and inside the dormitory corridors, a social world of considerable intimacy and mutual dependence. Those conditions did not cause the outbreaks in the way that a contaminated air supply might cause them. What those conditions did was lower the threshold. They created a setting in which the social transmission of physiological distress was possible, and then they provided the social density through which that transmission could travel. Across the 5 documented cases, and across the longer record they belong to, certain threads are consistent. The affected groups are overwhelmingly female. The settings are institutional: schools, factories, military formations, public buildings. The symptoms are real in the sense that matters most. The people experiencing them are genuinely experiencing them. Their bodies are responding with genuine physiological changes, and no amount of deciding not to be affected offers protection to the next person in the sequence. The investigations that follow are careful and honest about what they find and what they do not. The environmental audits come back clear. The laboratory analyses find no pathogen, and the epidemiologists mapping the sequence of cases find, again and again, that the path the event traveled is the path of friendship. The specific image from the Southeast Asian factory floor that the data provides is a simple and particular one. There is a workstation where the first worker sat. There is the exact moment when she put down what she was working on and began to go down. There is the person who turned to her first, someone she shared a dormitory room with, someone she had traveled with from their village, someone who knew her family. And there is the sequence of what happened next, traced outward, from that point, along every line of closeness and care, moving through the rows of the factory floor, not the way that air moves through a space, but the way that concern moves through a group of people who are bound to one another. The floor itself, with its rows of workstations and its particular social geography, holds that sequence in the record that researchers have assembled over 2 decades of following this phenomenon wherever it arrived. The friend-to-friend sequence, mapped in research notebooks, traced through the documented timestamps of each subsequent collapse, follows the pattern of affection and care with such consistency that investigators working in countries with different languages, different cultural frameworks, and different industrial contexts have arrived at the same finding. It is one of those findings that does not seem less interesting on repetition. The body follows friendship. The nervous system reaches along the lines of attachment. The social world in these events leaves a trace in the physical world precise enough to be mapped, measured, and set down in the documented record, where it remains, accumulated across 5 decades and 5 continents, as a particular kind of evidence about how human beings are connected to each other in ways that go considerably deeper than choice. The factory floor in Cambodia or Malaysia on an ordinary morning before any of this has happened looks like what it is: a large room full of people doing careful, repetitive work arranged in rows, the sound of their work filling the space, the social geography of who sits near whom, invisible until something arrives that makes it suddenly and clearly visible. The pattern that investigators will later trace through the temporal sequence of a morning's events is already present in the seating arrangement, in the ordinary choices people make about where to be and who to be close to. It is present in the direction a worker turns when she wants to say something to someone she trusts. It is present in the slight change in posture that happens when a person becomes aware that something is wrong with someone nearby. All of that is already in the room, already shaping the floor, already the invisible infrastructure through which, if the conditions are right and the threshold is reached, something will travel in a pattern that does not follow the air. The vagus nerve begins in the brainstem at a cluster of neurons tucked behind the ears, and from there it travels downward through the neck, through the chest, past the heart and lungs, and all the way into the abdomen. It is the longest of the cranial nerves. It reaches further into the body than any other nerve that originates in the brain. Running along the left side of the throat, branching into the larynx, threading between the chambers of the heart, continuing down through the diaphragm into the stomach and intestines, it carries information in both directions, from the brain outward to the organs, and from the organs back up to the brain. And it does this continuously, without pause, without instruction from the conscious mind. In every person who has ever stood in a warm room and felt nothing at all unusual. Most of the time, the vagus nerve does its work invisibly. It slows the heart after exertion. It helps regulate digestion. It carries signals that adjust the airways in response to temperature and airborne particles, and it participates in the quiet calibration of blood pressure that keeps a person upright and oriented when they move from sitting to standing. The word vagus itself comes from the Latin for wandering, which is a reasonable name for something that travels so far and touches so much. In an ordinary hour, it wanders through its responsibilities without drawing any attention to itself at all. What it can also do, under particular conditions, is something rather more dramatic. The mechanism begins with the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system activating in response to a stressor. Heart rate rising, blood pressure climbing, the familiar preparation for effort or alarm. What happens next, in the sequence that ends with a person on the floor, is a kind of overcorrection. The parasympathetic system answers the sympathetic activation, not by returning the body to baseline, but by going further than baseline, dropping the heart rate and blood pressure lower than they were before the stressor arrived. The vagus nerve is the primary vehicle of this drop, and it fires and the heart slows, and the blood vessels in the limbs relax, and blood pools in the legs and feet. The brain, abruptly receiving less blood than it needs, loses the oxygen required to maintain consciousness. The person becomes pale. Their vision narrows. They go down. This sequence has a clinical name. Vasovagal syncope is what physicians call it when the autonomic nervous system produces this pattern of inappropriate drop, sympathetic activation, followed by paradoxical parasympathetic rebound, ending in a sudden failure of blood pressure and heart rate adequate to sustain an upright person. The word syncope simply means fainting. The vagus is named because it is the nerve doing the work. What the clinical label captures is not a disease, but a mechanism, a coherent, consistent pathway through which a nervous system that is attempting to respond to stress produces, instead, unconsciousness. It is a pathway the body follows without being asked. The person fainting does not decide to faint. They are not pretending, and they are not performing. Their blood pressure has fallen to a level measurable on a cuff. Their heart rate has slowed to a count audible on a monitor, and the blood their brain requires to sustain awareness is elsewhere. The syncopause is real by any instrument brought to bear on it. That the original stressor was social rather than physical does not change what the body is doing in response to it, and it does not change what the instruments show. Something different happens before the person goes all the way down. Standing in a warm room, feeling the early stages of the autonomic shift, many people begin to breathe faster. This is partly conscious, a response to feeling wrong, an attempt to bring in more air, and partly reflexive, the body's ventilatory response to a rising stress signal. The faster breathing feels like it should help. It brings in more oxygen. What it also does, in a way that runs counter to what the person intends, is remove carbon dioxide from the bloodstream faster than the body produces it. Carbon dioxide in arterial blood is one of the signals the brain's vasculature uses to regulate its own blood supply. When carbon dioxide levels are normal, cerebral blood vessels maintain a diameter that allows adequate blood to reach the brain's neurons. When carbon dioxide drops below its normal range, those vessels constrict. The constriction is the brain's response to what its chemistry is signaling, and what the chemistry is signaling correctly at the biochemical level is that carbon dioxide is low. What the brain's chemistry cannot distinguish is whether that low carbon dioxide reflects a genuine change in the body's metabolic state, or an anxious person in a warm room breathing faster than their metabolism requires. The condition that results from this drop in arterial carbon dioxide is called hypocapnia. In acute cases, the cerebral vasoconstriction it triggers can reduce blood flow to the brain by a substantial fraction, in some measurements as much as 40% relative to baseline. The person experiencing it notices dizziness first, then a slight flickering at the edges of vision. Tingling begins in the fingers and sometimes around the mouth because peripheral nerve function is also affected by the change in blood chemistry. The chest feels tight. The person believes, understandably, that they are not getting enough air, which leads to faster breathing, which deepens the hypocapnia, which intensifies the symptoms. All of this is occurring inside a body that is, by the standard measure of oxygen content in the blood, receiving more oxygen than usual. The accelerated breathing has increased arterial oxygen saturation, while reducing the carbon dioxide that blood vessels need to stay open. It is a situation in which taking in more produces less. The person faints, or approaches fainting, not because their blood carries too little oxygen, but because the vessels that deliver blood to the brain have drawn inward in response to a chemical signal their breathing created. What makes this mechanism relevant to the spread of fainting through a crowd is that it does not require a toxin, a pathogen, or any environmental agent to be circulating in the shared air. It requires only the conditions that warm, enclosed, socially tense spaces reliably produce: elevated heart rates, elevated respiratory rates, elevated cortisol, and the awareness that something is happening to the people nearby. Those conditions interact with hypocapnia in a direct and measurable way. A person whose baseline anxiety has already raised their respiratory rate slightly, who is standing in a room where the temperature is a few degrees higher than comfortable, who is wearing clothing that restricts their breathing somewhat, who has not eaten recently, and who is watching someone near them begin to look unwell. That person's physiological margin against vasovagal syncope is considerably narrower than it would be in any one of those conditions alone. The combination does not need to be extreme for the threshold to be crossed. The observer who watches someone faint is not simply an emotionally passive witness. Research in social psychophysiology has examined what happens in the body of a person watching another person in distress, and what it finds is that the response is both immediate and measurable. Skin conductance, the slight change in the electrical properties of the skin that reflects sweat gland activity under the skin's surface, responding to autonomic arousal, rises in the observer before the observer has consciously processed what they have seen. The nervous system recognizes threat in the environment and begins its response on a timeline faster than deliberate thought. Heart rate reactivity increases. Cortisol secretion, already a marker of background stress, rises further. Skin conductance is measured through electrodes on the fingertips or palm, and the line it produces on a monitoring display is a direct record of the autonomic nervous system's level of activation, moment to moment. In studies where participants watch another person faint or show signs of acute distress, the skin conductance reading does not wait for the observer to identify what they are seeing and decide how to feel about it. The line rises. The body has already made its assessment. In the social environment of a crowd or a shared space where identity and relationship connect the individuals present, that assessment is made faster and more strongly when the person being observed is known to the observer, when they are perceived as similar, when they belong to the same group. The rise in the monitor's line is steeper. The statistical vulnerability that follows, the narrower margin against vasovagal syncope, the increased likelihood of hypocapnia if breathing accelerates, is correspondingly greater. This is why fainting events in groups do not spread at random. The pattern is not diffuse. It is not distributed evenly across all the people present in a space. Documented outbreaks, when mapped against the social relationships of those affected, show a consistent structure. Those nearest to the initial faint and most closely connected by relationship to the person who fainted first are at the highest statistical risk of fainting next. The pattern moves through friendship. It moves through family connection and shared dormitory and the workstation 3 feet to the left where someone's closest colleague stands. It follows the lines of emotional proximity more reliably than it follows the lines of physical proximity, though in many settings the two overlap significantly because people who know each other well tend to stand or sit near each other in the first place. What this means is that the spread of fainting through a crowd is not contagion in the biological sense of a pathogen finding a susceptible host. There is no agent crossing from body to body. What is crossing from body to body is a signal, a visible, socially legible piece of information about the state of another person, received and processed by a nervous system that cannot help but respond to it, which raises the observer's own autonomic arousal, which narrows their own physiological margin, which makes their own vasovagal response more likely if the other conditions, warmth, standing, restricted eating, accumulated stress, are also present. The mechanism is physiological at every step. The trigger is social, and the pathway is entirely the body's own. Researchers looking at the data from multiple documented outbreaks have confirmed this pattern in enough cases across enough different settings and cultures that it has become one of the more clearly established findings in the study of mass psychogenic illness. The spatial and temporal sequence of who fainted and when, mapped against the social network of the group, shows a degree of overlap that is not consistent with random distribution, not consistent with airborne chemical contamination, which would produce a pattern related to ventilation and physical proximity, and not consistent with deliberate imitation. It is consistent with a nervous system responding to a signal that originated in someone it was connected to, and the response producing genuine physiological changes that led to genuine syncope. The specific finding about social identity adds something to this picture. The increase in autonomic reactivity when watching another person in distress is stronger when the observer perceives themselves as belonging to the same group as the person affected. This has been found in experimental settings and is consistent with what field investigators observe in documented outbreaks. The people unaffected by a fainting event in a shared space are often those who were present but identified less strongly with the group experiencing the outbreak: supervisors rather than peers, visitors rather than regular members, people who had been in the space only briefly. Their nervous systems received the same visual information. They were in the same room. The temperature and carbon dioxide concentration were the same for them. What differed was the strength of the social signal that information carried, which depended on the social relationship between the observer and the person observed. This is not a mechanism that requires susceptibility in any diminished sense. It does not require fragility or weakness or any departure from normal nervous system function. It is the normal nervous system doing exactly what it is built to do, monitoring the state of other people, particularly people it recognizes as belonging to the same group, and adjusting its own physiology in response to what it observes their state to be. The adjustment is automatic. It predates conscious reasoning. In most social situations, the adjustment is small and never noticed. In the right combination of heat, enclosure, stress, standing, relative hypoglycemia, and witness distress in a known person, it can produce syncope in an entirely healthy person who had minutes before no symptoms of any kind. The clinical documentation of psychogenic fainting has been refined through two investigative tools in particular. One is the tilt table test. A patient is secured to a table, and the table is slowly tilted from horizontal to near vertical, mechanically replicating the cardiovascular demand of moving from lying down to standing. The tilt table monitors blood pressure and heart rate continuously throughout. In most people, the body compensates for the tilt through reflex increases in heart rate and vascular tone that maintain adequate cerebral blood flow. In people with a history of vasovagal syncope, including those whose syncope has occurred in psychogenic contexts, the compensatory response is often slower, smaller, or both, and the drop in blood pressure and heart rate when it occurs is larger and faster. These patients have a cardiovascular system that responds to orthostatic stress differently from the control population, not because of any structural abnormality, but because of a pattern of autonomic reactivity that the tilt table reveals by asking the cardiovascular system to demonstrate it. In populations that have experienced psychogenic fainting, people who fainted during a documented mass outbreak, for instance, and who were later studied in a clinical setting, tilt table testing has found that the exaggerated cardiovascular drop occurs at lower tilt angles than in control populations. The tipping point is reached earlier. The margin that separates compensation from syncope is narrower. This is a measurable physiological characteristic. It can be expressed as a number, the angle at which the drop occurs, the degree of the blood pressure fall, the time elapsed before compensation fails. The tilt table does not reveal anything about what a person was thinking or feeling during their syncope. It reveals the behavior of their cardiovascular system under standardized orthostatic stress, and that behavior is consistent, coherent, and distinct from that of a control group. The other investigative tool is the electroencephalogram, which records the electrical activity of the brain through electrodes placed on the scalp. The pattern of electrical activity the brain produces varies depending on what the brain is doing. Alert wakefulness produces one pattern, deep sleep produces another, epileptic events produce a third that is sharply distinctive and recognizable. During an epileptic seizure, the EEG shows bursts of rapid, high-amplitude spike activity, the sharp waves that reflect the synchronized firing of large populations of neurons. The signature is recognizable across patients and across seizure types, and it is different from anything produced by a brain that is simply losing blood supply. During a psychogenic fainting episode, the kind that occurs in the context of vasovagal syncope, including the kind that occurs in mass psychogenic events, the EEG shows something different. There are no sharp waves. There are no spike discharges. What the recording shows is a general, mild, even slowing of the brain's electrical activity across the affected regions. The brain is going quiet. The waveforms are lower in amplitude and lower in frequency, consistent with what happens when neurons are receiving less oxygen and glucose than they need to maintain normal function. It is the brain's response to a drop in perfusion, to blood arriving in lesser quantity than usual. The pattern is not alarming, and it is not chaotic. It is simply a slowing, the brain reducing its activity to match its resources, the way a room of people might lower their voices when the generator is running down. This pattern is clinically distinguishable from epilepsy by anyone trained to read an EEG. The distinction matters because psychogenic fainting and epilepsy are two conditions that can superficially resemble each other to an untrained eye, particularly when the fainting is accompanied by brief jerking movements which can occur and which are not the same thing as seizures. The EEG separates them. The slowing of psychogenic syncope and the spike and wave of a generalized seizure look different on the same display. Researchers who have studied EEG recordings from patients experiencing psychogenic fainting episodes have described the pattern consistently enough across different patients and different events that it has become part of the clinical recognition of the condition. The body, in this moment, is following a recognizable path. There is something worth pausing on in this. The event begins with a social signal, someone fainting in a warm room, observed by people who know that person, and it ends with a distinctive, measurable, consistent pattern of electrical activity in the brain of someone who has lost consciousness. Between the social signal and the EEG trace lies a chain of physiological events: autonomic activation in the observer, increased skin conductance and heart rate reactivity, elevated cortisol, accelerated breathing in the warm enclosed space, a drop in arterial carbon dioxide, cerebral vasoconstriction, narrowed perfusion, and the paradoxical vagal rebound that drops blood pressure and heart rate below the level needed to keep the brain awake. Each step in the chain is measurable. Each step follows from the one before. The fact that the chain begins in the social world, in the sight of a known person going down, does not make any step in it less real or less physical. What it means is that the body's physiology is connected through real and traceable pathways to what happens in the social space it occupies. The autonomic nervous system runs as a kind of background infrastructure beneath the social life of any group of people in a shared space. Heart rate is adjusting, skin conductance is shifting, respiratory rate is changing in response to the emotional valence of nearby faces and the content of nearby sounds. This happens in any gathering of people at any ordinary level of social interaction and produces no symptoms because the adjustments are small and the physiological margins are wide. The conditions that narrow those margins, warmth, standing, hunger, sustained stress, the visible distress of someone nearby, are not exotic. They are the ordinary components of a hard afternoon in a difficult place, or a long formal ceremony on a hot day, or a factory shift that began before dawn and has not yet ended. When enough of those conditions coincide, the infrastructure that normally runs quietly beneath the surface of social life begins to interact with the social signals in ways that the body cannot distinguish from a genuine physical threat, and it responds accordingly. The skin conductance of a person watching a friend faint rises before the person consciously knows what they have seen. This is worth sitting with as a fact. The nervous system does not wait for the conscious mind to deliberate. It has already received the information, already assessed it as socially significant, already begun its response. The slight elevation in heart rate, the marginal increase in respiratory rate, the narrowing of the margin against syncope, while the observing person's awareness is still processing the visual information of someone near them going to the floor. The nervous system is, in this sense, faster than thought. It is making decisions about the safety and state of the environment based on social information in real time before the person who contains it has had the chance to decide how to respond. In a room where several people have already fainted, where the air is warm and close, and the baseline anxiety of everyone present is elevated, that faster than thought response is running in every person who is standing and watching and wondering if they are all right. This is part of what makes mass psychogenic events so coherent as a phenomenon when examined physiologically. It is not that one person's imagination spreads to another person's imagination. It is that one person's measurable autonomic state shifts in response to the observable distress of a connected person nearby, and that shift produces genuine changes in blood chemistry, vascular tone, cardiac rhythm, and oxygen delivery to the brain. The event is social in its origin and physiological in its mechanism, and the two descriptions are not competing accounts. They are sequential steps in the same chain. A person who has fainted during one of these events and recovered in fresh air, away from the group, often feels well again within minutes. This is consistent with the mechanism. When the person is removed from the environment that was maintaining the autonomic arousal, the warmth, the close air, the visible distress of others, the parasympathetic rebound resolves, blood pressure returns, cerebral perfusion normalizes, and the EEG slowing reverses. The recovery is typically as rapid as the onset, which is one of the clinical features that helps investigators distinguish mass psychogenic fainting from chemical exposure. Chemical intoxication tends to produce symptoms that persist or worsen over time, even when the person is moved, while the psychogenic pathway tends to resolve with the removal of the social and environmental triggers. The brain, in recovery, leaves no structural trace of the event. The neurons that went quiet during the hypoperfusion resume their normal activity. The mild EEG slowing reverses. The cardiovascular response normalizes. The episode ends cleanly, physiologically, in a way that reflects the nature of the mechanism, temporary, functional, driven by conditions that have now changed, rather than by any damage to the tissue itself. This is one of the reasons that prognosis for psychogenic fainting is generally good and recovery generally complete. The event, however alarming in the moment, does not injure the brain in the way that prolonged oxygen deprivation from other causes does. The pathway is brief. The brain reduces its activity to match reduced perfusion. The conditions change. Perfusion is restored. Activity resumes. The trace on the EEG that was showing mild slowing returns to its ordinary pattern, and the person who had been on the floor is helped to a chair, is given something to drink, and begins, after a little while, to feel like themselves again. What the EEG trace shows in those minutes of recovery is not dramatic. It is simply the brain's electrical activity finding its way back to the frequencies and amplitudes it maintains during ordinary wakefulness, a gradual return, waveform by waveform, to the baseline that was interrupted. To the trained reader of EEG recordings, the return is as recognizable as the slowing that preceded it. The pathway down and the pathway back run in the same direction using the same physiology and leave the same kind of evidence, coherent, consistent, and quiet. The body's response, though triggered by something as intangible as the sight of a known person in distress, follows a pathway so consistent and leaves a trace so recognizable that researchers working with the recordings can now identify what happened without being told, the slowing telling its own story in frequencies and amplitudes long after the event itself has ended. An assembly hall sometime in the early morning before the day's full business has begun. The chairs are filled. The ceiling sits low overhead, close enough that the air warmed by 100 bodies has nowhere particularly useful to go, and the smell of the room, old wood, cleaned floors, the collective warmth of people who have all been sitting in the same enclosed space for a while, is the smell of air that has been breathed and breathed again without much replacement. The windows are the kind that open only a little. The authority figure at the front of the room has not yet finished speaking. Everyone is facing the same direction, which means everyone can see the back of everyone else's neck, and no one can quite see the faces of the people sitting near them without turning, which is not something that feels easy to do right now. This setting, the low ceiling, the shared warmth, the rows, the collective orientation toward a single point of institutional authority, appears in the documentation of mass fainting outbreaks across countries and decades, with a consistency that researchers have found genuinely informative. It is not a coincidence. It is, by the evidence, something closer to a precondition. The physical environment comes first in the documentation because it is what the investigators can measure most cleanly. Temperature can be recorded, carbon dioxide concentration can be sampled, humidity can be established from readings taken at the time, and what the records consistently show is that the enclosed spaces where mass fainting events occur tend to cluster at the warmer end of the comfort range, with CO2 levels elevated by the straightforward arithmetic of many people breathing in a sealed or semi-sealed space for an extended period. This matters physiologically because elevated ambient CO2 shifts the chemistry of breathing in ways that raise the baseline vulnerability of anyone standing still in that room, particularly anyone who has not eaten recently, anyone who is tired, and anyone who is already experiencing the low background hum of anxiety that an institutional setting tends to produce. The space does not cause the outbreak, but the space lowers the threshold at which social and psychological factors become sufficient to tip a person from standing upright to sitting on the floor. The spatial pattern of spread, though, does not follow the ventilation. It does not move from the corner nearest the blocked window toward the corner nearest the functioning one. It does not diffuse outward in a radius from a ductwork opening or pool near the floor, the way a chemical agent denser than air would pool. When investigators map the sequence of who fainted and when, and then lay that map over the building's floor plan and its ventilation schematic, the two diagrams tell different stories. The ventilation map is a story about air. The fainting map is a story about people, and about which people were sitting nearest which other people, and about who knew whom well enough that watching someone go down was not a neutral, uninvolving experience. Researchers have noted this pattern across documented outbreaks in enough different countries and building types that it has moved from observation to a key diagnostic criterion. A chemical or environmental source produces a different spatial geometry from a psychogenic one. Chemicals pool, diffuse, travel with airflow, and affect people roughly in proportion to their proximity to the source and the time they have spent breathing the contaminated air. A psychogenic outbreak radiates outward from a social origin point rather than a spatial one. The two shapes, when mapped, are distinct enough that field investigators now use spatial mapping of case sequence as an early tool for distinguishing between the two types of event. The map of who fainted does not describe the room. It describes the relationships inside the room. A school calendar with certain days circled would, across the records of documented mass fainting events, show a consistent pattern. Examination days appear in the documentation with frequency that exceeds what chance would predict. Assembly days, formal gatherings where the whole institution is present in one space, facing a single authority with limited opportunity for movement or private conversation, appear with similar regularity. Inspection days, when an outside evaluating authority arrives to assess performance, compliance, or condition, generate a particular kind of shared anxiety that researchers have described as a convergence of stress. Many individuals, each carrying their own version of a similar worry, placed simultaneously in a shared space where expressing that worry individually is socially complicated, if not impossible. Vaccination days have also appeared in the documentation, which carries an additional layer of interest, because the vaccination itself provides a plausible alternative explanation that investigators must rule out before concluding a psychogenic cause, and ruling it out has, in the documented cases, required careful sequencing of onset times against injection times, and the sequencing has, in several well-documented cases, cleared the vaccination of causation. What these calendar events share is the combination of shared anticipatory stress, institutional surveillance, and limited individual autonomy over one's own response. Each person in the room is required to remain in the room. Each person is aware that their response to whatever is happening is visible to the authority at the front and to all the other people in the rows beside them. Each person is also aware that the people around them are experiencing the same institutional pressure, and that awareness is not neutral. It is information that the nervous system processes quietly in the same automatic infrastructure that regulates breathing and heart rate without requiring any conscious instruction to do so. When many people in the same room are running the same underlying physiological preparation for threat response, the room's ambient nervous energy is something that can be sensed, not through any mechanism more mysterious than facial microexpressions, posture shifts, breath patterns, and the small sounds of a group of people who are not entirely relaxed. There is a well-documented accelerant that appears in outbreak records with enough regularity to have earned a specific place in the epidemiological framework for MPI. Prior knowledge that peers have already experienced symptoms is, by the evidence, one of the most reliable ways to intensify and extend an outbreak once it has begun. This works through two distinct channels simultaneously. The first is the provision of a symptom template. When someone in a group learns that other members of the group have fainted, felt nauseated, experienced dizziness, or developed tremors, that information enters the group's shared knowledge base as a description of what the body might plausibly do next. The second channel is the elevation of baseline anxiety in members who have not yet experienced symptoms, because learning that people near you in a shared environment have become ill is at the level of the autonomic nervous system, a piece of information that registers as potentially relevant to personal safety, even when the conscious mind understands that no confirmed physical agent has been identified. Both channels operate simultaneously and both point in the same direction, toward increased physiological readiness in people who have not yet fainted, in a setting where that readiness, if triggered by the sight of someone else going down, is more likely to produce an actual physiological response. In the West Bank in the spring of 1983, the spread of the outbreak between schools followed the pattern that this mechanism would predict. Schools that received media reports of illness at neighboring schools experienced intensified outbreaks in the days following those reports. Schools where awareness of the outbreak was more contained showed a different pattern. The information about the illness was itself a transmission vector, and the transmission did not require physical contact or shared air. It required only that a person in a shared stress environment learn that others like them, in similar environments, had already experienced the symptoms and then be placed back in that shared stress environment the following morning in a room with a low ceiling and warm air, waiting for a school day to begin. The demographic consistency of documented mass fainting outbreaks across different countries, cultures, and decades is one of the findings that researchers have spent the most time trying to describe carefully, because the pattern is real and documented and also requires a particular kind of analytical attention to explain without misrepresenting it. Across the recorded cases, the majority of affected individuals are female. The ages involved most commonly range from the early teenage years through the late 20s. The settings are frequently single-sex or female majority: girls' schools, women's dormitories, factory floors, staffed predominantly by young female workers, female sections of mixed-sex institutions. This pattern is consistent enough across enough countries and cultural contexts that dismissing it as coincidence would require dismissing a considerable volume of epidemiological evidence. The question that serious researchers have worked to answer carefully is not whether the pattern exists, it does, but what the pattern is actually describing. What the pattern describes, according to the researchers who have examined it most carefully, is a set of structural and situational conditions, rather than a characteristic of the individuals who happen to be placed within those conditions. The settings where outbreaks cluster are settings characterized by high institutional stress, limited individual autonomy, strong social cohesion, and relatively few legitimate channels for expressing collective distress. Girls' schools and environments of political or social tension carry these characteristics. Factory floors where young women have traveled significant distances from home, share dormitory accommodation, and work long shifts in enclosed spaces under production pressure carry them too. Military formations carry a distinct version of the same combination. Religious ceremonies in enclosed spaces carry another. The demographic consistency, when examined through this structural lens, points toward the types of environments in which certain groups have been disproportionately placed. Environments that combine the specific cluster of conditions that appear reliably in the documentation that precedes outbreaks. Robert Bartholomew, whose work on MPI spans several decades and multiple book-length treatments of the documented record, has been among the researchers most explicit about this framing. The pattern in his analysis is not evidence of greater psychological fragility in female populations. It is evidence of which populations have historically been placed most consistently in the specific kinds of high stress, low autonomy, group-oriented environments that appear in MPI outbreak documentation. The body's social responsiveness does not select for gender. The environments that create the conditions for psychogenic spread have, in various historical and economic contexts, concentrated women and girls within their walls with a frequency that the outbreak record simply reflects. A group of young women working on a factory floor somewhere in Southeast Asia in the 1990s, Cambodia, or Malaysia, or one of the other countries where this was documented in that period, would have been living inside a web of social connection that outsiders might not immediately see. Many of them would have left their home villages to reach this work. They would have traveled together or arrived in the same period and formed connections quickly, because forming connections quickly is what people do when they have left behind the social network they grew up in and need to build a new one. They might share dormitory rooms, or the same bus route, or the same cooking arrangements. They would certainly share the experience of the factory floor itself, the sound of the machinery, the pace of the production line, the particular authority figures who set that pace, the accumulated fatigue of the shift, the shared knowledge of how much the job matters and what losing it would mean. All of this, invisible to a building inspector or an air quality monitor, is nevertheless the social infrastructure through which anything that happens on that floor, including a fainting spell, will travel. Social cohesion is the term researchers use for the strength of those bonds, the depth of shared identity, and the weight of mutual obligation within a group. What the epidemiological evidence shows across multiple documented outbreak types is that the degree of social cohesion within a group is one of the strongest predictors of outbreak severity. A group where people know each other well, feel accountable to each other, and would experience the distress of a close companion as something that registers in their own bodies. Such a group, when the conditions for psychogenic transmission are present, is a group in which an outbreak, once it begins, tends to spread further and involve more people than in groups where the social bonds are more loosely drawn. Anthropologists and sociologists studying this have reached for the language of biological contagion to describe it, not because the mechanism is biological, but because the structural analogy is useful. In biological contagion, the transmission route, the handshake, the shared surface, the proximity of breath, determines the network along which the pathogen moves. High contact relationships are high risk relationships. In psychogenic transmission, emotional intimacy, shared identity, and mutual obligation do the same work that physical contact does in biological models. The person who is most relationally connected to the first person who faints is the person most likely to faint next. That relationship is the transmission route. It is not metaphorical. It is, by the evidence, how the pattern maps. Researchers working from documented outbreak records have developed a concept called the index case, the first person to faint, the origin point from which the rest of the event unfolds. The index case is, in the spatial and social mapping of an outbreak, a specific point in a specific room at a specific time. From that point, lines can be drawn outward to the people who fainted next. And what the lines represent, in the documented cases where the social mapping has been done carefully, are relationships, friendship, proximity at work or school, shared dormitory, or shared bus. The lines that connect the index case to the subsequent cases are the same lines that would appear on a social network diagram of the group, and the two diagrams, when overlaid, align with a regularity that investigators have described as one of the clearest distinguishing features between psychogenic and environmental outbreaks. In a factory in Cambodia, where a mass fainting event was documented, the collapse of the first worker near a particular workstation was followed, in the minutes after, by collapses moving outward through the rows nearby, but not evenly, not in a smooth radius from the first point of collapse, the way a chemical agent spreading with the airflow might produce. The subsequent cases clustered around the social geography of the shift, around the people who were working closest to the first worker and who also knew her best, and then around the people who were closest to those people, the network of friendship and familiarity radiating outward, not from the workstation, but from the person. The rows between people who did not know each other well showed a different density of cases from the rows between people who did. The air went everywhere equally. The collapse did not. This asymmetry between the physical layout of the space and the social layout of the outbreak is one of the things that makes the documentation of mass psychogenic illness genuinely interesting to read, not because it is surprising in retrospect, but because the pattern is so coherent. The body follows the social map, not the floor plan, not the ventilation schematic, not the seating chart, unless the seating chart happens to reflect friendships, and in environments where people choose or drift towards sitting near the people they know, it often does. The space that matters in a psychogenic outbreak is the space defined by relationships. It has the topology of a social network rather than the topology of a room, and those two geometries in any real group of people are quite different from each other. Physical conditions and social conditions do not operate independently. They work together in a particular way that the documented evidence illuminates. A group with very strong social bonds in a well-ventilated, cool, low-pressure environment in which everyone feels adequately rested and fed will, by the evidence, produce very few cases, even if a single person faints near them. The physical threshold for psychogenic transmission is high when the other conditions are not present. Gained in a group with relatively loose social connections in a warm, poorly ventilated space under acute institutional stress will produce a different outcome from a tightly bonded group in the same space under the same stress. The physical environment sets the floor. The social environment determines how far above that floor an event travels. In the worst documented cases, the outbreaks that lasted days, that moved between multiple facilities, that affected hundreds of people, both sets of conditions were present simultaneously, stacked on top of each other in ways that the retrospective mapping makes visible. The warmth of the room matters. The CO2 concentration matters. The length of time people have been standing or sitting without movement or refreshment matters. Whether they have eaten matters. Whether they slept adequately the previous night, in the particular context of a group who is nervous about what today will bring, matters. Each of these factors individually contributes a small elevation in physiological baseline. Together, when stacked in the configuration that the outbreak documentation describes, they bring a group of people to a point where the sight of one person beginning to go down is sufficient additional input for the autonomic nervous system of another person, someone standing nearby, someone who cares about the first person, someone who is already warm and anxious and not entirely certain they are all right to do something dramatic and unmistakable and not remotely chosen. There are settings in the world where these conditions tend to collect. Assembly halls during formal proceedings are one such setting. Factory floors during long shifts are another. Military parade grounds during extended ceremonial formations where stillness is required and deviation from it is not an option constitute a third. Religious buildings during lengthy ceremonies in warm weather have appeared in the documentation as well, across several different religious traditions in several different countries, which suggests that the relevant variable is not the specific belief system or institutional form, but rather the combination of shared space, shared emotion, collective orientation, and the particular kind of stillness that formal ceremony requires. The formal inspection event, the occasion on which an external authority arrives to evaluate the group's performance, compliance, or condition, deserves its own attention in the documentation because it produces the stress convergence pattern with particular reliability. Everyone in the group knows the inspection is happening. Everyone has prepared in some way for the inspector's arrival. Everyone understands, implicitly or explicitly, that the collective outcome of the inspection will reflect on the group as a whole, which means that each individual's performance or composure contributes to a shared outcome that everyone cares about. The anticipatory anxiety of the inspection, shared across the whole group simultaneously, is the closest thing the documented evidence offers to a condition designed to create the convergence of anxious physiology in a single location. When the inspector arrives and the group is assembled together, the room contains a large number of people whose nervous systems are already running somewhat elevated and who are required to remain still, in close proximity, often in a warm enclosed space, while that elevation persists. Military parade rehearsals and ceremonies, which combine extended required stillness, formal uniform that can restrict circulation, warm conditions, and the particular kind of institutional pressure that surrounds performance in front of observers, have appeared in the documentation from multiple countries. The British Army's formal study of the phenomenon, prompted by repeated events of this kind, is among the more thorough institutional investigations into mass fainting in a non-clinical setting. The finding that emerged from those studies, that the pattern of who fainted followed the social geography of the formation, as well as the physical conditions of the event, contributed to the broader research picture that positions the two categories of conditions as simultaneously necessary rather than separately sufficient. There is something worth sitting with in the image of a researcher's notebook showing two columns side by side, the social network map of a factory shift and the sequence in which workers fainted, their lines and nodes corresponding almost perfectly. It is the kind of finding that does not arrive with fanfare. The researcher draws the two diagrams, places them next to each other, and the overlap is simply there, not argued for, not demonstrated through elaborate statistical inference, but visible as a structural fact on the page. The body of the person standing next to their friend in a warm room under institutional pressure is not following instructions when it responds to that friend's collapse. It is doing what the autonomic nervous system does when the conditions that precede its response are all present simultaneously. It responds. The fact that the conditions are social rather than bacterial, relational rather than chemical, does not make the response less real or less measurable. It makes the response interesting in a particular way that has required a particular kind of investigation to bring into clarity. The landscape that comes before these events is not in the end a mysterious one. The conditions that appear reliably in the documentation are not obscure or difficult to recognize once you know what the documentation shows. A warm, enclosed space, an extended period of shared institutional stress, a group with strong social bonds and limited individual outlets for expressing the anxiety those bonds carry, prior knowledge within the group that some members have already experienced symptoms, a formal occasion requiring collective stillness in the presence of authority. These are the conditions that the evidence describes, assembled from records spanning different countries, different decades, different institutional types, different cultural contexts. What they share is what the documentation consistently points toward: the body's capacity to answer the social world it is placed in, to respond to the physiological signatures of the people nearest to it, to follow the lines of relationship rather than the lines of airflow when those lines diverge. In a school assembly hall somewhere, a warm Tuesday in a year, when something is making everyone in the school a little more nervous than usual, a group of students sits in rows, facing the front. They have been sitting for a while. The air in the room has been breathed a number of times. The person 2 seats to the left of someone near the middle of the hall has not been feeling quite right for the past few minutes, and the person 2 seats to the left of her does not know this yet. But both of them came to school on the same bus this morning, and both of them are aware that yesterday something happened to a student in another class that nobody has explained yet. These are conditions, not causes, taken individually, but together, arranged the way they are arranged on a warm Tuesday in a room that could use another window. They are a particular configuration that the documentation describes, and the documentation, assembled from multiple continents and multiple decades of records, shows what tends to happen next when that configuration is assembled and then held in place long enough for the social geometry of the room to do what social geometry under those conditions does. The social network map and the fainting sequence map, when a researcher places them side by side in a quiet office somewhere after the event, overlap in a way that is not coincidental and is not alarming, and is, in the careful language of the researchers who have spent careers building this understanding, one of the most consistently replicated findings in the epidemiology of mass psychogenic illness. The body follows friendship. The pattern can be mapped, and the map, read without alarm but with the steady interest that the evidence invites, tells a coherent story about what it is to be a body placed inside a social world, sharing air, sharing attention, sharing the particular physiology of a warm room and a nervous morning, and to answer that world without instruction in the way that bodies, by the evidence, reliably do. The logbook opens to a blank page. The incident commander uncaps a pen and writes the time in the top margin. Not because anyone has asked for it yet, but because the time of the first collapse is the first thing that will matter when the analysis begins. It is written in plain handwriting on an ordinary line, the same way any other time is written, and then the work starts. What follows a mass fainting event in its first minutes is less dramatic than the event itself. The crowd has already done the visible thing. What comes next is quieter. The arrival of people with notebooks and monitoring equipment, the careful movement of affected individuals away from the larger group, the patient circling of a space that may contain nothing at all. Emergency medical services establishing a treatment area at a remove from the crowd. The first questions being asked in a calm voice to whoever can answer them. When did the first person go down? Where were they standing? Who was nearest to them? The questions are not random. The sequence in which cases occurred, and the location of each case relative to the others, is one of the first things an investigator uses to understand what kind of event this was. A chemical agent tends to affect people in patterns that follow airflow, the gradient of a plume moving through a space. A psychogenic event tends to affect people in patterns that follow relationships. These two maps look different from each other when they are drawn out, and drawing them is among the first things a careful investigator does. The incident commander notes the time of the second collapse and its location in the room. Then the third. The spatial distribution is being recorded, not to build evidence for a courtroom, but because the pattern, when it emerges, tells something essential about what the body was responding to. In some investigations, this map is the clearest data available. An air quality monitoring device is carried through a building where people have fainted. The investigator moves it through the rooms where cases were clustered, noting the reading at each point. The readings come back normal, and this is noted with the same care as an abnormal reading would be, because the absence of a chemical signal is itself a finding. It tells the investigator something, the same way a test result that comes back negative tells a clinician something. The building contains nothing identifiable in the air. This is recorded. The investigation continues. A building with nothing in its air is not a building that has been cleared of significance. The investigators are still working. They are asking questions about the group's recent history, what the week had looked like, what pressures had been present, whether there had been an illness reported among members of the group in the days before, whether anyone had heard about a similar event at a connected institution. These questions matter because MPI does not arise from nowhere. It arises from a specific combination of environmental and social conditions, and the investigation that takes these conditions seriously tends to produce a more complete account of what happened than one that stops at the negative air quality result. The World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention both include field guidelines for investigating events of this kind. Among the features that consistently point investigators toward a psychogenic origin rather than a chemical one is the finding that affected individuals improve when they are moved to a different environment. This is a recognizable pattern across multiple documented outbreaks. A person who was unable to stand moments earlier moved outside into open air and away from the crowd becomes noticeably steadier within minutes. The symptoms are real, the dizziness is real, the faintness is real, the cardiovascular response that produced them is real, but the conditions sustaining them dissolve when the social environment that generated them is no longer present. A second feature that points investigators towards psychogenic origin is the pattern of who was and was not affected. In chemical exposure events, the distribution of affected individuals tends to correspond to physical proximity to the source. Those nearest the point of release are the first and most severely affected. In psychogenic events, a different distribution tends to emerge. People who were physically present in the space, but unaware that others had begun experiencing symptoms, often remain entirely unaffected, even if they were standing closer to the initial cases than some people who did develop symptoms. The boundary between affected and unaffected is drawn not by proximity to a chemical gradient, but by knowledge, by whether the person was aware that something was happening. This finding, confirmed in the field guidelines of multiple international health organizations, is one of the clearest distinguishing features available to an investigator in the early stages of a response. The air quality readings matter, the sequence of cases matters, and the careful mapping of who knew what and when they knew it matters at least as much as either of those. The school corridor is quietly reorganized. The students who have fainted are taken to a room that the unaffected students cannot see into. This is a logistical decision, not a punitive one, and the documentation of MPI outbreaks across multiple countries shows that it consistently affects the duration of the event. Studies comparing cases where affected individuals were separated from the unaffected group early in an event against cases where separation was delayed show a pattern that has been replicated enough times to be considered settled. Early separation shortens the outbreak, reduces the total number of cases, and produces faster recovery in those already affected. The mechanism behind this is continuous with everything understood about how these events propagate. Witnessing a faint in someone nearby, particularly someone whose face is familiar, someone whose distress carries weight, raises the autonomic arousal of the observer. It raises their heart rate. It changes the pattern of their breathing. It moves them physiologically closer to the threshold at which they themselves might faint. Removing the sight of affected individuals from the unaffected group reduces that arousal in real time. The corridor continues. The event becomes smaller. This intervention is simple enough that it can be implemented by whoever is managing a space, a teacher, a floor supervisor, an event organizer, without waiting for medical teams to arrive. and in documented cases where it was implemented early by people on the ground before professional response arrived, it made a measurable difference. The research record on this is not complicated. The intervention is low cost and almost never discussed outside specialist literature. What the specialist literature does discuss with considerable care is what happens when the early response to a mass fainting event goes wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a failure of medical care, but wrong in the specific sense of a misidentification of the cause. Several well-documented MPI cases show a clear pattern. When official statements early in an investigation suggest a possible chemical or environmental toxin, the outbreak tends to grow. New cases appear at locations that were not previously affected. People who had been unaffected become anxious about their own potential exposure. The suggestion of a toxic cause, transmitted through the same social channels that transmitted the original symptoms, produces a second wave. The 1983 outbreak across schools in the West Bank showed this pattern. In the weeks it continued, official statements that raised the possibility of chemical exposure reached students and teachers at schools where no symptoms had yet appeared. Some of those schools subsequently experienced outbreaks. Epidemiologists, examining the sequence of events, found that the spread followed the path of media reporting about the chemical hypothesis more closely than it followed any physical geography. The suggestion of contamination was itself a kind of transmission vector. The announcement of a possible cause became, in effect, a cause. This is not a failure unique to that time and place. Similar dynamics have been documented in factory outbreaks, in school outbreaks, in outbreaks that occurred in countries with very different media environments and public health communication practices. The general principle appears to be stable: early, authoritative, clear communication about the absence of a toxic agent, when that absence has been established, reduces the likelihood of a second wave. And the absence of that communication, or its replacement with speculative statements about possible toxins, tends to extend and amplify events that might otherwise have resolved quickly. The investigator writing in a logbook at a mass fainting scene is contributing to something that will outlast the event by years. The documentation produced in the first hours of a response, the sequence of cases, the spatial distribution, the air quality readings, the separation protocol implemented, and at what time, becomes the raw material for epidemiological studies whose conclusions will shape the guidelines used in the next event. The incident commander recording the time of the first collapse in plain handwriting is adding to a body of knowledge that is still being built. That body of knowledge has taken shape over decades through the accumulated work of researchers who have spent careers studying events most institutions prefer not to discuss at length. The stigma attached to psychogenic illness is well documented in the research literature. The reluctance of affected individuals to accept a psychogenic explanation, the reluctance of employers and school authorities to have their environments associated with psychological distress rather than physical hazard, the media tendency to frame these events in ways that either dismiss or sensationalize them. Researchers working in this field have described spending as much time negotiating access to affected communities as they spend analyzing the data once it is collected. The follow-up studies that exist are often the work of individuals who stayed with a community after the initial event and the initial crisis had passed, and who found the resources to return and ask how people were doing 1 year later, 2 years later, 5 years later. These studies are not generously funded. They are labor-intensive and slow. They tend to produce findings that are quieter and more complicated than the dramatic event they grew out of, and they tend to be read by fewer people than the original outbreak reports. The knowledge they contain is nonetheless real, and it has changed what practitioners do in response to these events. A researcher makes a follow-up call to a former student 2 years after an outbreak. The conversation is about how she is now, whether the symptoms have resolved, whether school went on in the way she had hoped, whether she has thought about what happened in the intervening time. The researcher writes down that the tics resolved within months of the initial event. They write down that early psychological treatment was associated with faster recovery, and that the students who received it earliest tended to do best. They also write down something that sits slightly separately in the notes, that the stigma did not resolve in the same way. That former students described feeling marked by what had happened to them in ways that the end of the physical symptoms did not erase. This finding appears across multiple follow-up studies. The physical symptoms of mass psychogenic illness tend to resolve. In studies of school outbreaks and factory outbreaks, where affected individuals received appropriate support, the majority of people affected returned to full or near full functioning within months. The psychological sequelae, the anxiety, the sense of having been perceived as weak or unstable, the social complication of having been the person who fainted in a public setting, tended to persist longer and to be less fully resolved at follow-up. These are findings that shape the current understanding of what appropriate response looks like, because they suggest that the medical response and the social response are both necessary, and that the second is at least as important to long-term outcome as the first. Across the follow-up research on factory workers in Cambodia and Malaysia, a consistent finding emerged. The degree to which affected workers recovered well was related not primarily to the severity of their symptoms during the outbreak, but to two factors: whether their experience had been officially acknowledged and whether psychosocial support had been made available to them in the aftermath. Workers whose experiences were dismissed or explained in ways that implied they had been pretending or that something was wrong with them tended to carry more residual anxiety. Workers whose experiences were met with genuine care, whose supervisors communicated that what had happened was real, that it was not shameful, that support was being provided, tended to do better over time. This is a finding with practical implications that extend well beyond the factory floor or the school corridor. It says something about what human beings need when something unexpected and disorienting happens to their bodies in a public setting. The body's response was real. The experience was real. The acknowledgement of that reality by someone with the authority to offer it appears to be part of how the experience is metabolized rather than carried forward as an unresolved weight. The air quality monitor has been packed back into its case. The logbook has been closed and will be typed up and filed. The students who were taken to the separate room have been assessed and most of them have gone home. The building is quiet in the way buildings become quiet when the event they contained is over and the people have left. An investigator sits in a car in the car park writing final notes about the sequence of events, the spatial distribution of cases, the interventions that were implemented, and when. This document will be reviewed by someone else and revised and eventually included in a data set alongside documentation from other events in other places. The picture it contributes to is one that has been assembling for a long time. What the assembled picture shows across the research literature on mass psychogenic illness is not a world in which groups of people occasionally break down in ways that are mysterious and alarming. It shows a world in which the social body and the individual body are more deeply continuous than everyday experience suggests. The nervous system that regulates heart rate and blood pressure does not operate in isolation from the room a person is in, the faces they can see, the emotional state of the people nearest to them, This is not a flaw. It is the condition of being a social animal, the condition of having evolved in groups, of having nervous systems that are calibrated against the nervous systems of others. The capacity to transmit distress through a room is the same capacity that allows comfort and safety to transmit through a room. They run on the same infrastructure. A garment factory in Cambodia on a working day that is not the day of an outbreak. The sewing machines are running. The rows of workstations are occupied by workers who know each other, who know each other's names, and something of each other's circumstances, who have been on this floor long enough to have a sense of who sits where, and who is having a difficult week, and who has been tired lately. The sound in the room is the ordinary sound of machinery and work. Outside the windows, the light is the color it is at this hour of this day. The shift will end when it ends. Someone at one workstation glances across at someone at the workstation 2 rows over, and there is a small acknowledgement between them, a look, nothing more, and then both of them return to what they were doing. This is what the social network of a factory floor looks like on the days when nothing happens. It looks like people in proximity to each other who have built over the months and years of working in the same space a web of familiarity and care. The researchers who have studied MPI outbreaks in settings like this one mapped those networks carefully. Who was friends with whom, who ate lunch together, who came from the same home region, who had been on the floor longest, and whose judgment newer workers trusted. When they laid those maps against the maps of who had fainted, and in what order, the 2 diagrams overlapped. The pattern of symptoms followed the pattern of relationships with a consistency that made randomness the least plausible explanation available. The workers on this ordinary day carry those networks with them in the same way they carry everything else about their working lives. The relationships are real, the mutual awareness is real. The capacity each person on this floor has to affect the physiological state of the people nearest to them is real. On most days, this capacity is invisible, present but not activated, running beneath the ordinary surface of a working shift. On a small number of days, in a specific combination of circumstances, it becomes visible in ways that are disorienting and difficult to name. And then the shift ends, and the next shift begins, and the machines keep running. The follow-up researcher who visited this factory knew that the outbreak had happened here. They had the documentation, the sequence of cases, the spatial distribution, the number of workers affected. They sat with workers and asked careful questions about how things were now, what the weeks after the outbreak had been like, whether anything had changed. They wrote down the answers. They added those answers to a data set that almost no one had chosen to fund, and that would be read, eventually, by the people who set the guidelines for what happens the next time. There is a particular quality to the work of documenting something that most institutions find inconvenient. It is slow. It requires returning to places that do not necessarily welcome the return. It requires asking people to revisit experiences they may prefer to have put behind them. The researchers who have built the body of knowledge around MPI have done this work over years and decades, often without the institutional support that other research areas receive. Sustained by the finding that the events they were studying were real, that the people affected by them were real, and that understanding what had happened was worth the effort required to understand it. The understanding that has emerged is not simple, but it is coherent. These are events in which the body responds to the social world with the same physiological mechanisms it uses to respond to any other kind of stress. The response is measurable. It follows predictable pathways. It spreads through populations along lines that can be mapped. It resolves under conditions that can be identified and sometimes created. The people it affects are not unusual. They are not fragile in any exceptional sense. They are people who were in a particular place under particular circumstances when a particular set of conditions converged, and their bodies did what bodies do under those conditions. A triage nurse at a mass fainting event is holding the wrist of a young woman who fainted 15 minutes ago and is now sitting upright on a chair in a room separate from the hall where the ceremony was still ongoing. The nurse notes the pulse, returning now toward a normal rhythm. The young woman says she does not know what happened. The nurse says that is a common thing to say, and it is true. The experience of fainting, in most cases, includes no clear internal warning, no felt sense of what was coming. The body made a decision. The autonomic nervous system made an adjustment, and then the person was sitting on the floor or being held by the people nearest to them without having experienced the transition in any coherent way. The nurse records the time at which the pulse returned to normal range. This will be included in the sequence document. Later, it will be one data point among many, contributing to the aggregate understanding of how long recovery from vasovagal syncope takes in a mass event context versus a solitary one, and whether the presence of others who are also affected speeds or slows the individual recovery. These are not questions that have fully settled answers. The data set is still being built. What is established is that the young woman sitting on the chair will most likely be entirely well within the hour. Her blood pressure has normalized. Her breathing has returned to its ordinary depth and rate. The particular combination of conditions that moved her across the threshold, the standing still, the warmth, the formal occasion, the awareness of others around her, the particular cascade of autonomic adjustments that followed, has dispersed. The conditions are no longer present. The body has returned to its ordinary state. She will leave the room when the nurse has finished the assessment. She will go back into the world. The ceremony, she will find out later, continued. Other people she knows were also helped to chairs and have since recovered. The event will be talked about for a while, and then it will settle into the background of shared memory in the way most events do. For some of those who fainted, the experience will not carry much lasting weight. For some, particularly those who found the public nature of it difficult, or whose experience was met with less understanding than it deserved, it may take longer to settle. The researcher with the follow-up questions will arrive eventually, if the incident is documented and if the funding can be arranged. They will ask their careful questions and write down the careful answers and add those answers to the long ongoing record. The record is not complete. It is unlikely to become complete. The events that compose it are too various, too geographically distributed, too often poorly documented at the time to permit a comprehensive picture. What the record does allow is a well-grounded and coherent understanding of a phenomenon that before this kind of careful work was done was typically dismissed as either mass hysteria in a contemptuous sense or collective malfunction in a way that explained nothing useful. The understanding now is more accurate and more patient than that. It holds the events it describes as real, the bodies it describes as coherent, the people it describes as worthy of the same careful attention any other kind of medical and social experience would receive. The fact that the transmission route is social rather than biological does not make it less real. The fact that the symptoms resolve without a pharmacological intervention does not make the experience less significant. The fact that the body responds to the emotional state of the room in measurable physiological ways is not a failure of the body. It is the body working exactly as it was built to work. The sewing machines in the factory are still running. The logbook in the incident commander's office has been filed.